So welcome everyone to the latest Interspecies Conversation lecture. My name is Cristian Hernandez. I'm the head of program here at Interspecies Internet. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the trustees and the organization to another edition of our monthly speaker series. This talk is part of a regular series of online lectures, which invites leading professors, scientists, researchers, artists, and students to share work that contributes to advancing our understanding of communication in other species, and also touches on adjacent topics related to non-human animal cognition, behavior, and welfare. We aim to showcase emerging ideas and discoveries and host open discussions where our community can join the conversation with ideas and feedback. And I should mention, if you enjoy this talk or previous lectures of ours, please consider donating to Interspecies Internet to help support our programming, events, and other projects and activities. You can find a link to donate at the top right of the navigation bar on our website, interspecies.io, as well as in video descriptions on our YouTube channel. All right, then, yeah, let's move on to why we're all here. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Kristin Andrews. Andrews is a philosopher and author whose research combines philosophical and empirical approaches to questions about animal consciousness, agency, and sociality. She holds the York Research Chair in Animal Minds at York University in Toronto, Canada, where she is a professor in the philosophy department. Andrews is a Canadian Institute for Advanced Research Fellow in the Future Flourishing Program and serves on the board of directors at the Borneo Orangutan Society Canada. Her books include The Animal Mind, An Introduction to the Philosophy of Animal Cognition, How to Study Animal Minds, and Chimpanzee Rights, The Philosopher's Brief. She's currently writing a trade book on animal culture and multi-species norms. In this talk, Kristin will take multiculturalism out of the human domain and explore some implications of the robust research program in animal culture. She will discuss how culture cannot be the secret to human success, given how widely distributed it is amongst other species, and look at how animal culture and social norms can provide insights into cognition, sentience, and goal-directed behavior. So welcome again, Kristin, and it's so wonderful to have you with us today. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Cristian, and thanks to everyone at Interspecies Internet for the invitation, and thanks to all of you for showing up at whatever time zone it is that you're coming from. I'm going to share my screen, and I think does that look good? Cool. And what I want to talk to you about today, or the ideas I want to share with you today, are really a kind of a teaser from the trade book that I'm writing right now that Cristian mentioned. So the working title is Societies of the Wild, and it is I'm only 3 chapters in, so it is quite a teaser as opposed to a trailer of the completed work. But I wanted to share these early ideas with you, and hopefully share some discussion and some thoughts afterwards. So the electrified Cold War fence between Czechia and Germany came down more than 30 years ago, but these red deer continue to respect the border. This isn't something that the red deer evolved to do. It's something they learned to do, and they learned it from us, even though we didn't know we were teaching them. We shared our culture with these deer. Humans have tried in many ways to separate ourselves from other animals, offering a variety of answers to a what makes us special question. And one of these answers has a long history, this idea that non-human individuals have their knowledge and skills and social structures innately, and humans are individual agents who can learn and build cultures. So Socrates praised ants as the social and gentle species, but he thought that they were social and gentle naturally. And so he hoped to be reincarnated not as an ant or a bee or a wasp, but as a human, because humans can overcome their nature. Humans are rational and creative. David Hume suggested that birds instinctively know how to build nests, unlike humans, who must learn to build their shelters. The scientific discoveries of animal cultures that we've seen in the 20th century have really shattered these old opinions. In the last, 60 years or so, we've discovered macaque potato washing on Fukushima Island that's socially learned. We've learned that bird song dialects are socially learned. And then scientists began exploring this idea that animals of the same species create groups that have behavioral traditions that differ from one another. And one of the main findings was the Culture in Chimpanzee paper that came out about 25 years ago that found that when you look at different groups of chimpanzees, you see significant behavioral differences and differences when it comes to material technology. Since that Culture in Chimpanzee paper, the research in animal culture has absolutely taken off, with research on culture in all kinds of species, including cetaceans, fish, and insects. So at this point, right, in 2023, we're at the point that we're finding culture in every species that we've looked for it. And by culture, well, what we mean by culture is going to be one of the questions for this talk. There are lots of questions that we can raise about these kinds of finding, and I just will briefly go over 3 different kinds of questions that we can ask that I've been exploring about animal culture. So the first question is, well, what do we mean by culture, right? What kind of culture are we finding in bumblebees and fruit flies and chimpanzees and elephants? And then I'm going to turn to the question, well, what kind of groups have cultures? And then finally, I'm going to turn to the question of what can we learn about flourishing with other animals? So let's start with this kind of foundational question. What kind of culture are we talking about? So we can talk about 2 different kinds of culture. So thin culture, we can describe as socially learned patterns of behavior. This is the definition of culture that you see in ethology, biology, and animal behavior. The idea that what culture means is that this behavioral tradition that you see was acquired through some form of social learning. But added to that basic understanding, we might also have that this pattern of behavior is seen in some populations, but not others, so that you have cultural diversity. One might also add to it that this difference is not explained ecologically. So it's not that chimpanzees are cracking nuts in this location, but not in that location, just because there are no nuts in the second location or no rocks that you can use to crack the nuts. One might also add to this thin understanding of culture that the culture is not genetically based, that there is no biological basis for the difference in behavior. And one might also add to the thin kind of culture that the focus is really in terms of material culture. When there are experiments that are being done about the social transmission of a behavior, this behavior is often in terms of how to operate a puzzle box or how to manipulate some sort of physical object. And so I'm going to mostly leave thin culture to the side. There's a lot to say about thin culture, but I'm, for this talk, interested in this concept of thick culture. And I'm going to argue that what we see in animal culture is something that resembles thick culture. And by thick culture, I mean patterns of behavior that are important to group members in some sense, that they care about these group patterns. And these group patterns are maintained via a kind of social pressure. And that in these kinds of thick culture, there exist social norms. And social norms, unlike material culture, when they're studied, they're going to be studied in terms of rules about how to behave, what is permitted and what is not permitted, how societies are structured, political organization and things like that. So by norms, this concept of social norms is robustly discussed and investigated in the human context. And a definition that is common when you talk about social norms in the human context is that a social norm would be an informal rule that structures human behavior, regulating what is appropriate, required, prohibited, or permitted. And the kinds of examples that are often discussed would be religious ceremonies, group behaviors like celebrations, styles of dress, greeting norms, greeting with a kiss, a bow, a hug, and so on and so forth. And it's also very common when in the human social norm discussions to see this claim that social norms are uniquely human, that this is one thing that divides us humans from all other animals. So you see in the literature claims that social norms require a uniquely human form of self-consciousness or a unique kind of norm psychology, or that it requires gene culture coevolution that only humans have, which is why discussions of thin culture are very interesting, but that's just a side note. We also see claims that human unique social norms are grounded in certain kind of cognitive capacities that only humans have, maybe cognitive control mechanisms that were selected for tool manufacturing or pedagogical training of tool use, or maybe that social norms require shared intentionality and shared agency that only humans have, right? So there's been this quite an interesting emphasis on what makes humans special and why non-human animals don't have norms and why social norms are human unique. But in fact, there hasn't been much empirical research on animal social norms. So all of these claims, I think, are quite premature. And what we really need to do is ask this question: do we see evidence of social norms in non-human animal species? And in order to ask that question, we need to have a good account of what we mean by a social norm that we can empirically investigate in beings that don't use languages that we currently can understand, who aren't communicating with us in a way that we could just ask them what they ought to do. So we need to have a way of kind of operationalizing this idea of social norms. And so Evan Westra and I have proposed this construct of a normative regularity, which is a socially maintained pattern of behavioral conformity within a community. So this idea is that you have a pattern of behavior, like in thin culture, but this pattern of behavior is socially maintained. All we mean by social maintenance is that conformers are rewarded in some way. Naive individuals are given opportunities to learn, and that violators of the behavioral pattern suffer some consequences. It might be third-party punishment, but third-party punishment is also a cultural practice that we might not see in all communities, but there will be some sort of response, negative response to violators of these patterns of behavior. And so we've developed this by looking at also the kind of cognitive and social properties that would be involved in having a normative regularity, identifying psychological dimensions of normative regularities, things like rule following, behavioral understanding, collective agency and motivation, social elements of normative regularities, things like punishment and pedagogy, right, that allow us to socially maintain these social norms. And we did this in order to point out that the kinds of cognitive mechanisms and social structures that support norms in one community might be very different from the kinds of psychological capacities and social structures that support norms in another community. And so with Simon Fitzpatrick and Evan Westra, we have argued for a dimensional approach to studying social norms, where we can map out in this dimensional space the different kind of patterns we see in norms in animals, from Mormon crickets to chimpanzees to children. And I'm not going to go through the details, but just to give you an example of the rule following aspect, dimension of social norms, which is something that you saw in the Dan Kelly definition of social norms, that it involves following a rule. Well, what does that mean to follow a rule? What sort of cognition do you have to have? We argue that you can have lots of different kinds of cognitive capacities that will support something that will fulfill this idea of rule following. So at the very lowest level, without much cognitive activity at all, we can see rule following to be an emergent regularity, with rule-like patterns of behavior emerging organically from individuals' shared biology. So the image on the screen is of Mormon crickets. And this is a case where you've got something that looks like rule following at this level 1 level that involves crickets moving forward when they swarm, eating everything that's in front of them. And the behavioral regularity is to continue marching. And the sanction, if you don't march, is that you're eaten by the guy behind you, because that's what crickets do. They eat what is in front of them. So if there's a cricket that stops moving, they get eaten. So this would be a very low level account of rule following. And then we develop cognitively more and more complex, from implicit representations, something like a model-free reinforcement learning, to non-propositional representations, maybe a mental map, to something like a propositional representation of a rule that we might be able to speak, translate into human language. And then we see also public linguistic representations of rules when it comes to signs in our communities. And so this work that we've been doing on social norms leads us to develop the hypothesis that many animals have thick cultures with both social and material elements. And such cultures are had not just by so-called smart animals, but are really widely distributed across. And because if a property is widely distributed, it's likely evolutionarily old. We're interested in looking at an evolutionary reconstruction of social normativity and normative cognition in evolutionary history. So we already have complex sociality in the Cambrian. And when you look at these trilobites from the fossil record, we can tell that they were highly social. They traveled together in single file as they searched for food. When it was time to molt and reproduce, they would gather together with large numbers of other trilobites and search for a trilobite that had the most attractive head horns or shoulder spines, suggesting evidence of sexual selection already going on at that stage. So the kind of conclusions of this first question, what kind of culture, is that we think that I think that the first social behaviorally flexible animals faced a new kind of problem: how to coordinate their behavior and correctly predict what others are going to do. And I hypothesize that to constrain the space of possible behaviors, successful species inhibited their own behavior through norms and used norms to help predict what others would do. This would make normative cognition evolutionarily ancient and quite simple, suggesting that even before there is thought, there might have been ought thought in the animal world. So it's not that normative cognition is some amazing and late arriving cognitive development that maybe only humans have, but it's something that we share from our very earliest evolutionary history. And it might, in fact, be that developing is thought was the evolutionary advantage, was a real significant development in cognitive evolution. So this allows us, thinking about social norms in non-human animals and the kind of thick culture that they have, allows us to think differently about the evolution of cognition and mind. The next question I wanted to raise is this question of what kind of groups have culture. So if you look at the cultural literature, you'll see things about culture in different chimpanzee troops, or behavioral differences in elephant herds who have different cultural knowledge. You might see claims also about culture in different nests of bumblebees. Some engage in string pulling if they've been taught it by a human and learned it socially from other bees, whereas wild bumblebees don't demonstrate that behavior. Um, I've also argued that captive dolphin communities have culture, that culture is not something you just see in wild populations. But all of these examples, most of them very common examples, have culture be a property of species. But we've been turning our attention to this idea of multi-species societies, looking at multi-species bird flocks, or groups that involve street dogs and humans, or pet cats and humans living in a house together. We're also looking at examples of cooperative fishing between fishers and dolphins, and then, of course, the fish that are being caught. And likewise, relationships between herders and their dogs, the wolves that the dogs are protecting the goats from, and familiar examples of honey guide birds who lead humans to find bee nests where the humans collect the honey and the birds get the wax that they eat. And so this is just an example of a photo from Bangalore where you've got the relationship between the dogs and the humans are such that we're very interested in exploring what dogs have learned from humans and what humans are learning from dogs. In this community, my collaborators describe dogs following human traffic laws, knowing what humans are supposed to do when it comes to feeding them, and even in some cases, dogs being found not liable for human attacks because the humans have violated the shared norms by mistreating the dogs. So cultures form across species, not just within them. And I think that conceptualizing interspecies norms can help us to live better by negotiating the animals we share the world with. So this leads me to this final question I want to address that has kind of three parts and picks up on this idea of flourishing with other animals and living well with other animals. So what can we learn from this idea of animal culture and multi-species societies about communication, about conservation, and about multiculturalism? So the first thing is communication and the responsibility that comes with communication. So of course, sharing norms requires learning from others and recognizing others as agents, someone you can communicate with or learn from. And this requires having at least some kind of communication system. But when you're engaged in changing norms, you have to negotiate, which might require a more sophisticated form of intentional communication. You have to perhaps know that you're working to change a norm, as opposed to just picking up the norm because you're living in the society that already has the norm and you're socially learning it. And as you all know from the Interspecies Internet community and others, we have seen a huge number of projects that have been looking at communicating with non-human animals by introducing human languages or artificially constructed by human communicative systems to animals. And with these systems, we've been able to share ideas with animals, or at least ask animals to do things. In the case of, for example, Lou Herman's work with the bottlenose dolphins, the dolphins were asked to answer questions, to perform particular acts, like tail touching a basket or putting a hoop inside of a ring, something like that. But in order to negotiate, we need to have really robust two-way communication. And this is some of this work by Sue Savage-Rumbaugh with the bonobos and Irene Pepperberg with the African gray parrots allow the animals to communicate back. As you also know, there's been an absolute explosion of interest in translating natural animal communicative signals using machine learning methods. And the promise of this research is that we'll be able to understand what the animals are saying without first teaching them how to communicate with us using a language that we've created just for that purpose. So with this, like, promise comes as certain kinds of responsibility. Because if we can communicate and negotiate with other animals, I ask, do we then create additional responsibilities to those other animals, which in fact may be hard to live up to? And here I reference Steve Cook's really beautiful paper called Betraying Animals, where he describes the kind of relationships that we have when we're working with animals, where we then gain responsibilities to them because of these kind of caregiving relationships that we've taken up when we are working with animals on our farms or working with animals in a veterinary context when we're caring for an animal. Do we then owe them something that we didn't owe them because of these relationships that we formed? And if we come up with the ability to communicate with the animals, what sorts of responsibilities do we have? One really compelling piece of video that I'm not going to show, well, anecdote comes from the example of Bruno, a chimpanzee who learned American Sign Language at the University of Oklahoma with Roger Fouts. After that research program, after he was done being used in that program, he was sent to a biomedical facility when the funding ran out. And many years later, Mark Bodemer, one of the members of the Language Project, found Bruno and came to visit him. Bruno hadn't had anyone to talk to all those years in the biomedical facility. And when he saw Mark, he began to sign. And what did he sign? He signed key out. So if we learn to understand what animals are saying to us, and they say, go away, leave me alone, after we've spent all this effort learning how to understand them, are we then gaining additional responsibilities to do what they ask us to do, to leave them alone, to stop shipping lanes because the dolphins and whales are saying, this is too noisy, it's bothering us. The second issue I want to raise is an issue related to conservation and negotiation. So with the capacity to negotiate, we gain new ways of responding to conflicts, right? This could be in the case of the whales and dolphins who tell us, go away, the noise is bothering us. We then, if we can communicate with them, have new ways of negotiation. But even without those ways of communicating, we are finding ways of negotiating with wild animals in order to help modulate some conflicts in that natural context. So one of my favorite examples here is Monica the elephant in Valparaiso in India. She was the matriarch of her community and used to lead raids on ration shops. And this led to humans reacting every time they saw elephants coming into the village, which led to the elephants becoming more and more violent. And this led to conflicts and tragic results. But at some point, Monica lost her role as matriarch and left the herd and started living alone. And as she was living alone, she started coming into the village, but not raiding, being peaceful. And this kind of negotiation came, and the community in Valparaiso started appreciating Monica, and she became a very important member of their community. So there was some sort of successful negotiation there. We also see examples where we might be able to negotiate with the Balinese robber bartering macaques who live at Balinese temples and have been extensively studied. These macaques like to go and steal things like, well, in this case, sunglasses, but also cell phones and cameras from tourists. And then they take the object over to temple guardians and exchange them for a food item. So is there a way we can use social norms and understand these animals' interests in order to negotiate with them in a way that they will stop stealing things from the tourists to begin with? And perhaps there's some promise in handling the case of the orcas ramming boats in European seas. Maybe we can figure out what they want and understand their interests and negotiate with them in this case. A second aspect of conservation is, when it comes to thinking about animal culture, and multi species cultures kind of flips a lot of the ways we've been prioritizing thinking about conservation, which has been a species first approach. If we flip that and take a culture first approach and a species second approach, it helps reveal certain things. For example, it reveals that cultures are fragile, and more fragile than genes. They can't be preserved in amber. And so when you look at projects like Colosso Biosciences plan to de-extinctionize the woolly mammoth, we see that there's some significant problems with this very proposal. What they're going to do is take woolly mammoth DNA and gestate it in an elephant and raise it, perhaps with elephants and human caregivers. And what you'll have is something entirely new. This is not a project of conservation, but a creation project of a hybrid between a biological woolly mammoth and a multi-species culture of captive elephants and their human caregivers. It won't be a woolly mammoth anymore. Finally, the last point I wanted to make is about multiculturalism and cultural appropriation. So we've known, we found that members of different species gain information from one another. For example, they can learn to recognize predators by eavesdropping on alarm calls, or animals can recognize where there's food because they see, for example, vultures circling around a carcass, attracting hyenas or coyotes or what have you to eat that food. But less well recognized is that members of different species also sometimes adopt one another's practices. So some chimpanzees in a Gualago Triangle beat their chests, copying the gorillas that they live closely with. Some orangutans chew up Dracaena leaves and apply the lather to sore joints, just as the local Dayak humans do. And we don't know who learned it from whom. But when it comes to the weaver bird nests, there are theories in anthropology that suggest that humans learned how to weave baskets by watching birds first building nests. And so this planet really has a long history of multi-species multiculturalism and cultural appropriation, which I think should make us think differently about what cultural appropriation is and appreciate that this is an ongoing practice, that is not something that's just recent invention because of human multicultural societies in North America, but go back millions of years probably. And all of this is really leading me, as I write this book, to invite us and to think about myself, what many different things we can learn about living well together when we think through the multi-species, multicultural worlds of animals. So thanks for your attention, and thanks to my collaborators and my funders, and to my dog Riddle, who is part of my multi-species family, who's here living in my basket I wove that I learned perhaps from birds to weave. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Kristin, for such an interesting talk. Excuse me. There's a lot of really fascinating ideas to think about. Yeah, so at this portion, we're going to open up the floor to comments and questions from the audience and community. So yeah, while everyone's gathering their thoughts, preparing their questions, I'll just remind you all that you can make your remarks in the chat, again, by selecting the chat icon at the bottom of the screen and then typing your question. Or if you'd like to speak on the call, select the react icon, then the raised hand function, and I'll call you in sequence. And also, if you'd like to feel free to sort of introduce yourself and say a little bit about your background before sharing your thoughts as well. And maybe kick things off with the kind of question that I was, never mind. Holly, go ahead.
Sorry,
No, not
I
at
didn't
all.
hijack, but I I'm kind of curious, like as somebody who's interested in like kind of I make video games. I'm very like studied art in school and like am very kind of invested in those spaces. Um, I'm curious about like, and one thing we talk about is like, I mean, cultural preservation, like kind of how do we make like artifacts out of like these kind of ephemeral materials. I'm curious about like ways that maybe like, I don't know. I wonder like you were talking about this preservation of species and things like that, and it definitely seems easier to study corpses maybe than how those corpses related to one another, but I wonder like how that lens could change to like look at histories of culture, like once we like come from this basis that's like, okay, like animals do have culture, like what does it look like to study that, like by digging it up, basically, or like how do you do that, or like are there interesting people like starting that research. I just like don't know enough. But yeah, just thinking about like digging up like I don't know, like pots from like Roman pots and stuff. Like we're able to make these deductions, I guess, by like pulling back from our experience. Like how would you do the same for animals, I guess? Something I'm curious about.
Yeah, great. I mean, there are a lot of rich questions in there. So the first, is anyone doing any kind of animal archaeology? The answer is yes. People are doing that research and are working in digging up stone tools that capuchin monkeys have been using over many years. And what this research is finding is that the tools are becoming more and more efficient over generations, which is a hallmark of cumulative culture. So I mentioned cumulative culture as one thing that some anthropologists think is human unique, but when we look for it, we're finding evidence of that in other species as well. Just on this archaeological record issue, I think that I've been, especially because I'm weaving baskets, I've been really frustrated with the fact that we don't have the ability to preserve, like to find the fiber art that was done, the fiber technology, the creation of cordage, which was probably a very important, very early hominid technology that maybe we would be able to uncover if those fibers existed, but we find rocks is what we find. Um, but I like to think about what we could have found if the bird nests were preserved over time as well. Unfortunately, nobody's found any evidence of bird nests pushed into clay over time in order to kind of reconstruct that archaeological record. And then related at the beginning of your question, you were discussing this idea of preserving history and preserving culture and the value of culture. So when we look at like the UNESCO World Heritage Sites and UN projects to preserve human cultures, human languages, cultural practices, we then might ask, oh, should we be doing this with non-human animals as well? And I think there's some tricky challenges that come with this idea of kind of trying to preserve a culture in a non-human animal society, just as there are tricky challenges about preserving cultures in human societies, because culture changes. Like that's the one thing that we can count on. Cultures are both conservative to a certain extent. That's why we can describe them as like being shared among people and over some time, but they also change. And if we try to solidify a culture and say, no, you can't change, that's not respecting the autonomy of the individuals of that culture. Perhaps what we can do instead is document the cultures that exist. And so this is what's being done with chimpanzees, for example. And there's a kind of a race to document the different cultural practices in chimpanzee societies, at the same time that really tragically these animals are losing population because of human encroachment. So it's yeah, like indigenous languages we see them being lost in time. It's a kind of a tragic race to at least document them, if not preserve them. Thanks for the
Thank you
questions.
so much for your answer.
Thank you. Jeff, I noticed your hand was up earlier. I don't know if it's...
Yeah, thanks, Kristin. Lovely as always, and keep doing what you do. I noticed, and I might have missed it, but you stuck with the word communication and didn't use language very much. And I wonder if that's, in your mind, it seems like another null hypothesis that should go out the window. And the bigger question is, how is the languages different across cultures in the same way there are differences in human language? So I wonder if you'd just expound on that. And what if,
Sure.
I study wolves and elk, primarily wolf communication, and what if there is no latent space, no geometrical latent space, and we still don't even know what a word is in any species but ours? If you can't map those two latent spaces, you can't do the Google Translate that others are trying to do. But at the same time, you can take indigenous cultures or just people who hang around animals, and they know that this bark means, hey, give me some space here.
Yep.
And so my fear of AI is we're waiting for some mystery that we already kind of know. And so just comment maybe on you didn't use the word language, or did you? Maybe I missed that.
I probably didn't, because I've got a chapter on language and communication in my textbook, The Animal Mind, and one of the points is that nobody really agrees on what language is. And so if you use the word language, some people say that's an unproblematic claim, and other people will get completely up in arms. And I don't think that debate is useful right now. And so that's why I stick with communication. I think that there's probably a lot more going on in the communicative systems of other animals than we're even beginning to that we can tell. Even when we're living closely with the other species, and we have for generations and generations. So I agree that I call this folk expertise in one of my early papers, the kind of knowledge that you have when you're living with other animals. This includes indigenous communities who are living with and hunting caribou, who know what the caribou want, where they're going to be, and have been really good at managing those populations. And then the Canadian government comes in and tells them, oh no, you need to do this because this is what we've decided. And there's huge conflicts there and court cases and so on. I think that knowledge is something that is should be appreciated by the Canadian government, for example. But I also think that there's probably more going on in the animal communication than what even experts like that are picking up, because of the sensory modalities that the animals have that we don't have. So I'm not able to smell the signals that maybe are going to be relevant just because I don't have the same kind of capacity, olfactory capacities that they do. And so there might be a lot more subtle modulations, right? If you have, say, a vocal signal that's modulated with an olfactory signal, then you have something that some people who say language has to be productive in this way where you're combining signals in order to create new meanings. You might actually get that, but it's not in a single modality, and we just don't know that. Yeah. And on the Google Translate, all these AI programs, I'm curious but I'm not betting on it myself. But I'm watching it. Yeah. I have another talk that's online if you're interested about the ethics of those programs. I think there are some ethical challenges with them, that some of which are recognized by them themselves, but others of which, like the Steve Cook questions and the kind of new responsibilities that we take up, haven't been recognized. Yeah, thanks for the questions. And
Yeah, thanks for the riff.
Joanne, you want to pose your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kristin. I really appreciated your talk. Jeff's question really brings up to me the ways that culture has been constructed by humans. So the first thing that I want to know is that if you contend with the emergency of what humans, Western humans in particular, have said about what culture means, and then if you have done that, how do you see the ways that we have understood culture up until now reflecting on non-human species? Are we going to be putting hierarchies upon cultures on non-humans and then creating and replicating some of those things that we have done across our societies? Thank you.
yeah, thank you for that question. It's really important. So just as the biologists started using the concept of culture in their work, anthropologists were throwing out the concept of culture, because even with Boaz's move away from the idea of a single culture, which has hierarchy, civilized and uncivilized, to Boaz's idea that there are lots of different cultures and that they're not hierarchical, they're just different. I have conversations with my anthropologist friends about should we, as not the biologists, but as philosophers, as humanities researchers, be using the term culture in this context, because might it just recapitulate some of those earlier problems? So I completely understand the worry. I certainly am not in a position where I'm going to be ranking anybody on better or worse culture. This is why I really like the dimensional approach, because I think what we're going to find is there are differences, and recognizing the differences as well as recognizing the similarities is going to be really important if we want to live well with other animals, know how to communicate with them, know how to negotiate with them. But if we start getting into a place where we're being normative about those differences and saying some are better or more important or more valuable, then we run into those old problems that I want to avoid. So thanks so much for raising that. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciated your answer.
Thanks.
Treasure, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. And I really kind of have a strong feeling about Steve Cook's Betraying Animals kind of theory, in that I used to work for a company called So Far Ocean for a few years, and we would make buoys that we just started putting hydrophones on so we could hear what was actually going on in the ocean. And we had like maybe 1,300 buoys in all the oceans around the world. That was one part of the business. The other part of the business was creating better shipping ways for cargo container ships, for gas savings and less rolling for the ship for cargo. The problem I foresaw was that suppose we get data back saying that the ocean is far too noisy for marine cetaceans. What would the shipping companies do, being that they're the main way we get all of our product? They're not just going to shut down. And I started doing research on propeller design, and I don't know if you've ever seen a propeller from one of these boats. They're as big as a house. And so, the cavitation is what causes a lot of the noise. So you'd almost have to redesign the propellers for some of these large shipping vessels to make any real difference in the noise in the ocean. So I wonder, at a certain point, if we do find like that we can communicate with chickens and cows and pigs, that basically put us in an awkward position of saying, hey, how can we eat something that's almost sentient, that is sentient, that has feelings, that has culture, that is something that is on par with the intelligence that we would recognize as intelligence? And what do you think we need to do as a society to prepare ourselves for the inevitable you know, leveling of the playing field when it comes to consciousness and the shared responsibility we all have to probably a living biosphere that is also in some way trying to communicate with us. And I know
Yeah.
it's kind of a lonely question, but I thought as far as the oceanographic part and our responsibility goes, it really, I think that's probably the biggest question. What do we do once we find out that things are thinking like we think?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for your question, and thanks for letting me know about your work and this idea of redesigning the propellers in order to try to make the oceans less noisy. I wasn't aware of that sort of move, but that's cool. Yeah, so it's an enormous question about what we should do given what we're learning about non-human animals, and it's not just culture. So, you know, on the second slide, I had fruit flies and bumblebees. It's not just chickens; it's all life. Basically, is what we're finding, not just vertebrates. I was also part of the New York Declaration of Animal Consciousness that was launched in April, where we organized a group of leading scientists and philosophers who are presenting research that suggests very strongly that we should take seriously that animals are sentient, that they are conscious very broadly, including in insects and all vertebrate animals and crabs and cephalopod mollusks. So we're already, I think, there, that there's sentience. I would go a step further from some of my colleagues and say I think that we can generalize to animal life, that there's some degree of sentience in all of animal life. And so what do we do with that knowledge, especially coupled with the ethical premise that harm to sentient beings is a moral bad and something that we should seek to avoid. I think that one thing we can, in my own, is this being recorded? Is this going on live on the internet too? The Q&A?
Well, yeah.
Yes. Okay. So one of the things that I've been thinking about doing is learning from communities who have been grappling with this question for generations. In Western philosophy and science, in the last 100 years, we've been denying sentience to many, many non-human animals. So I think we haven't been doing a lot of great ethics on this question. When you look at the animal ethics literature and sentience literature, it is focused on like cows feel, chickens feel, but if the insects feel and the worms feel too, then we've got more challenges than just like, let's be vegan. Let's be vegan isn't going to solve the problem because we're still killing animals who are sentient when we're producing food. So this is what I think it's an enormous question. What I do when I'm talking to people in contexts like this is I suggest the first step is to just look at the animals outside your house and inside your house, like the spiders that might live in your house and the rats that might live in your backyard that are eating your bird feed that you don't want there, and recognize they're sentient too, and think about how you can negotiate with them as opposed to, you know, killing the spider or putting out a trap for the rat. Thinking about this in your own personal life in a way that is not as difficult as changing your entire life, but just starting with the relationships you have with the particular living animals around you as a start. So.
Yeah, it's a really huge topic to cover, but yeah, Carrie, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, hey everybody. Hi, Kristen. I'm Carrie Freeman. I work as a professor of communication in Atlanta. I really thank you for the work you're doing in raising the status of other animals by talking about culture. I wanted to ask a question about like the North American kind of wilderness, quote unquote, management model, you know, and how it's based on species and populations. So how do you think if we shifted the focus to like a culture, we talked about non-human animal cultures on the North American continent, and like how that would change what wildlife policies we had, like in terms of how we would manage or kill individuals of species, if we're not just talking about them as populations, like they're always like, oh, their numbers have finally gotten to the point where now they're not on the endangered species list, so you can kill them or whatever. All the fights that we are constantly having about that, especially with predator animals. But anyway, how could it change, and is it even possible for us to shift over to kind of managing wildlife related to like a model of culture, not species?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing is that people who are pushing this this line of culture really mattering for conservation is that individuals matter in each society. So you've got each society of animals of the species, but in those societies, if you kill off an important keystone member of that society, the society falls apart. And we see this with some of the cases of culling of wild elephants. And now you have young elephant males, bulls, who've grown up without the kind of constraints that they would have been given if there were older males in their herd who were stopping their behavior, teaching them the old rules, basically. We see that, like, we know that that matters dramatically for conservation, and that needs to be changed. But then there are other considerations. I think it's Hal Whitehead who argues that if biological diversity is important for species to evolve, then the very same arguments can be used to defend the claim that cultural diversity is important for species to evolve as well. You need to have a lot of different cultural traits in order for species to have the opportunities to change in response to anthropogenic and non-anthropogenic changes in their environments. And if we were, in our conservation efforts, focusing just on numbers and not paying attention to the diversity of cultural practices as well, then we might be preserving biological diversity while killing off cultural diversity, which is just as important for the future survival of the offspring of those groups. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Mark, can you go ahead?
Yes, thank you. I'm afraid I missed the beginning of your talk. So if you've already covered what I wanted to ask, then I apologize. But what I'm interested in this context is the differences in the cultures between, for instance, mammals and birds who bring up their offspring, and the large number of especially aquatic animals who throw their eggs in the water and they never even see or have any contact with their offspring ever again. And presumably the much more rapid changes in culture in the populations of these animals than there would be where things are handed down the generations like it is with us. And I'm wondering if your work covers this, and if so, in the culture of animals like octopuses and fish who never see their parents, if there are lessons that we can learn from their cultures.
Yeah.
Big question, but
Right, and that's a great question, and the science is not there yet on the kind of social learning that happens in these kind of animals that don't have parental care. But I do think that what we're seeing in some of the cases where we've got gregarious, like the opportunities for the octopuses in Jervis Bay to gather in a gregarious group because of the amount of food is in the environment, there's suggestive evidence of social learning in these communities. There's changing of behaviors. There seems to be emerging behavioral patterns and enforcing, female behavior and defending territories and things like this. And in the, my opinion and my way of looking at sociality is that there isn't an asocial animal, right? the orangutans used to be described as asocial because they didn't live in big gregarious groups like chimpanzees. But my colleague Ann Russin, who studied orangutans for many years, gives this analogy and says, oh, they're just like humans who live in the prairies where I grew up. You only see each other once a week at church, right? So there are different ways of structuring your societies that might be very widely distributed. You might not see each other very often, but you might have the kind of horizontal learning from individuals who are not your parents, who you run across from time to time, who are a little bit older and learn from someone who is a little bit older. So the science, I don't know of the science being there yet, but it's definitely something that is on the radar. Yeah, it's an excellent question. Thanks.
Thanks. Look forward to hearing more about that.
Yeah.
Great. I'm going to read a couple questions out from the chat. Emma said, super interesting. Thank you. I'm a master's student studying the coyote-badger hunting relationship, and I wonder if you have come across this in your work. And if so, do you have any thoughts on how this relationship or others like it fit into animal culture?
Thanks, Emma. I don't know about the coyote-badger hunting relationship. I haven't come across that one yet. I would love to hear more if you'd be willing to share it. Thanks.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I'm like laying on the couch weird, so I'm not going to turn my camera on. But
Sure.
yeah, so it's this interspecies relationship where two carnivores will hunt prairie dogs and ground squirrels together. So they each use their different hunting skills, and then they like complement each other when they work together. So like the badger can go underground and dig up prey. And if the badger is unsuccessful and the prey pops up above ground, then the coyote is there and can capture it. And there's not much that we know about it. And so kind of my work is looking at the environmental conditions that are needed for this relationship to occur. So like kind of time of day questions, seasonality questions, and like where on the landscape within prairie dog colonies, far away from humans, those sorts of questions. But yeah, so I was just curious if you came across it, and some of my questions that I don't think we're going to answer is like, how is this behavior learned? And is this something that's like potentially passed down and taught from like the parents of like, we do hunt with badgers or we do hunt with coyotes because it's something that's part of indigenous knowledge too. And so this dates back to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So, yeah.
That's a very cool case. Thanks so much for sharing it. I think that I mean, I'm familiar with other kinds of cases of cooperative hunting, of course, and one of the examples I often use is the eels and groupers who cooperatively hunt. And I like that one because there are communicative signals involved in those cooperations, and they've been studied. So the grouper will point to a location, and if the eel doesn't come right away, the grouper will then shimmy their body in order to get the attention of the grouper. So this looks like something that, you know, people like Michael Tomasello, who argue that an important part of communication is having an attention-getting signal that monitors the attention of other organisms that they're trying to communicate with, that you see this in this interspecies pair. But I don't think there's any evidence or any knowledge about how those signals are learned or if they are innate or anything like that either. But it's just so exciting how much we have still to learn, you know, now that people are asking these questions. So I'm so excited to see where you go with your work, Emma. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I call the coyote badger relation, or the grouper moray eel, is like the underwater version of coyotes and badger, because it's like
Okay.
the same thing where the eel is like the badger and can go in the crevices and like catch prey there, and then the grouper is like the coyote and hunts in open water and above ground. So
Cool.
yeah, there's definitely still a lot to learn about it. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Carrie left a comment earlier that I'll just read before getting to the other questions in the chat. She just mentioned, I wanted to share that Gordon Haber's work on wolves in Denali, Alaska, also called for a preservation of cultures, not species. And what we lose when we killed members of wolf families with trapping and hunting in Alaska was cultural and specific to these families. So she's just recommending the book titled Among the Wolves by Mary Beth Holman and the late Gordon Haber, if anyone wants to check that out. Tammy asks, or first says, thank you very much. It seems that humans are much more violent and cruel than animals for various reasons. Do you think animals can learn from us to be violent for unnecessary reasons? It's a shame we haven't learned from animals. It seems that we humans are far more violent. The question is violence a part of culture?
Yeah, those are questions I don't really have the expertise to answer. We'd need to study the levels of violence in different species. I know that yeah, it's tricky, and humans do a lot of harm. 100% agree. Do we learn to harm one another? Yeah, it's not my area. But there's probably science out there on humans learning to harm from one another. So the answer is probably yes, but that's just from me reading as a general person in the world. Yeah, I know. I like to focus on both the like positive and negative sides of culture though in the work. So it's important to recognize that it's not all great, and we don't like to like not all things that animals are learning to do either are things that I might as a person think would be a lovely thing to happen. I worked at Lou Herman's dolphin lab, and I watched, as they call it, forced copulation, as I called it, rape, of a male dolphin, and a male dolphin raping a female dolphin day after day after day until they were just physically separated, which was pretty horrific thing to watch. I don't think he learned it from anyone because he was the only male in that group, but yeah. Animals like us are complicated.
Yeah, Eric asks, do you have the experience or any experience of animals trying to communicate with humans? And in this case, what are their questions? If only humans are trying to communicate and ask questions, will the animals' responses be, too human oriented?
Mm-hmm. I mean, certainly I would say, I mean, I guess I would ask you, Eric, whether you've had experience of animals trying to communicate with you. I think as someone who's spent a lot of time with different animals, including my dog Riddle, he tries to communicate with me all the time, right? He will tell me he wants to go outside by at first ringing bells I hung for him on the door, later by scratching. That dolphin I told you about was tried to communicate to me once by presenting me his erect penis. I got out of there. I was standing outside, it was fine, but I think that was an attempt to communicate. I've worked with orangutans who have certainly come up and tried to show me things, right? Just grabbed my arm and then stuck out their lip and showed me a bunch of berries that they had in their mouth and wanted me to look at them, because when you throw them on the ground, they pick them back up and put them back on their lip and present it to you. So I think that we see these things like attention getting signals, drawing attention, repeating behaviors that suggest that animals are communicating to us. I actually have a paper on pantomime communication in orangutans, where we looked at these cases like the orangutan showing us the food, the berries, to see if it was food, is how we interpreted it. But one of the best cases I witnessed was an orangutan who was, these are rehab orangutans we were working with in Borneo. And the orangutans often got cleaned by the babysitters by taking a leaf. They'd take a leaf and wipe the dirt off their head. And Checheb, one of the young orangutans, came over to me and Anne one day, and we were hanging out, and then he gave us a leaf. He had a bunch of dirt on his head. And usually when the orangutans give you a leaf, you clean their head. That's what they're asking for. But we pretended like we didn't understand it. And so we dropped the leaf. And then Checha picked the leaf up again, brushed it on his head twice, handed it over to Anne, and then she brushed his head. So these are the kinds of things that I think we can very well interpret as animals trying to interpret, communicate with us using the kinds of communicative signals that they think we can get, right? Because humans are stupid when it comes to understanding orangutans. And so the orangutans have to act things out for us where they don't need to do it for one another, because I think the shared background is much greater than it is between us and the orangutans. So yeah, those are some experience I've had with animals trying to communicate with me. And I imagine a lot of people who've been with animals have had similar experiences.
Yeah, and so finally, Karen Hood asks, well, it says that she's interested in AI ethics and asks, I lost the question. Are folks in Canada working to protect animals from interspecies communication efforts, as good intentioned as they may be?
In what sense? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, Karen, do you want to elaborate on this?
Yes, I mean from a policy standpoint, or from a professional ethics standpoint across, university system or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know of any policies that are that would stand in the way of doing that kind of research. Are there any you have in mind?
No, I'm not looking for it to stand in the way of research, but
Okay.
to sort of guide the research in an ethical way, for example, not wasting a wild animal's time trying to send clicks their way, or, things like that. And then also, all of the cascade of things coming down by, like, maybe animals would seek out attention from the researchers, or maybe that could disrupt their social group in some way, or build resentment among the attention seekers, or the ones revealing secrets to the outsiders and things like that. There's like, when you talk about culture, there's like information and brain data about like where the resources are, where the marine nurseries might be, things that they might not want everyone to know, and then also like who can talk to them, like who's authorized to speak on behalf of humans, answer questions that they might have, and so on.
Good, right, yeah. So there are many ethical issues that arise, and I don't know of any policies in Canada that have specifically addressed those, at least not on a federal level. Animal care committees across, different universities are going to have different people on those committees, and they're going to make different judgments if those projects come across them. This is part of why I think it's really important to consider what the ethical implications are of these kinds of projects now, before people start proposing doing more research on these things, so we can get ahead of it. Yeah, but I don't think that I haven't run across anything like that. I just want to, when you mentioned the idea of like knowledge that the animals might not want other species to have, privacy rights come into play, and there is some work, philosophical work on privacy rights for non-human animals that Angie Pepper has done. If anyone's interested in that particular question, she's got a nice paper. And my PhD student, Mariah Alcantara, is also working in that area of whether animals might have privacy rights from humans in some cases.
Yeah, I think this is a huge question, guardrails for the use of AI in animal communication research. And it's definitely a topic that Interspecies Internet hopes to be involved in the near future as well. Yeah, I think this is maybe all the time we have. I think we'll have to wrap it up here unless there are any final questions. But yeah, Kristin, thank you so much once more for joining us and for sharing some of your thought-provoking work with us here today. Also, thanks to the community again for attending and engaging. We're always so grateful for the turnout and for the dynamic discussion. Yeah, Caro is posting some links in the chat that you can use if you'd want to learn more about our organization or stay up to date with events, projects, and other activity. And connect with a community of researchers and enthusiasts on social media, or by visiting our YouTube channel, or joining our Slack channel, or subscribing to our newsletter. Kristin, do you have any links for your online presence that you want to add to the chat? People can follow your work.
Oh, okay. I can just put my website in there. I've got links to papers and talks and videos and public facing writing and stuff like that there too.
So perfect. So yeah, once more, on behalf of the Interspecies Internet, the trustees and the community, thank you so much, Kristin, for your generosity and your time. And please join us in October for our next Interspecies Conversations talk. And see you then.
Thanks everyone for the fabulous conversation. I really enjoyed it.